Hello everyone. In this chapter of Life on Planet Earth, we are going to address the evolution on a large scale. That evolution on a large scale, it's basically also called macroevolution, or the production of new species over time. Now, when Darwin and many other people mention about a relationship that exists between organisms that existed before, way long before this time, and organisms of today, some people express skepticism. Why? Because they said, well, if you have organisms that existed yesterday and that are connected to organisms that exist today, we should actually see a link between the two. So for a long time, it was difficult to prove the concept of descent with modification. So common ancestor that got modified over a long period of time and gave a wide diversity of different other organisms. So here we see in the fossil record that we have here the fossil of Archaeopteryx. That fossil of Archaeopteryx shows a few things that I would like to attract your attention upon. First, it's that you have this organism that has a tail that doesn't leave any doubt that this is a real tail. Interestingly though, this tail is covered with feathers, right? We see these structures here actually are feathers. Then we see actually the wings right here, also covered with feathers, and the legs here that are very reminiscent of the leg of land animals. Now, furthermore, we see in that fossil that the head actually has teeth. When looking closely at this organism, it appears that a drawing of the organism, when we actually reconstitute the shape, the structure of the organism, it falls between that of a reptile and that of almost something like a bird. But it was not, right? It was not a bird. It was not a reptile. It was something in between, right? Now, furthermore, it was shown later on that the feathers in this organism may have been playing the function of insulation to provide warmth. Eventually, the feathers evolved to become more and more light, more and more suitable for flight, right? So here we have an evolution of what the feathers have become. So they are going from being there for specifically warm to actually playing a function that is completely new, which is one, to make the modern bird very light. And actually, as a matter of fact, the bones of modern birds are very light. The density is very low, right? And along with the fact that these feathers have evolved to actually specifically favor flight for these organisms. So now there is no question that these birds can fly, for instance, from Hawaii to Alaska in a way that is very much sustainable. And actually we wonder how this is possible, right? So in between the wings, the feathers, and the tail, we see this organism that is completely caught up between two worlds, right? The world of reptiles and the world of birds, right? So as we go through this chapter, a number of questions, we want to keep in mind a number of questions. One, how do scientists determine whether an organism is a new species or not? What processes drive the evolution of new species? Are these processes different from the processes we addressed when we talked about microevolution in populations? Finally, can the fossil record tell us about the origin and extinctions of species over a long period of time? So these are a few things that we want to keep in mind. Our first step is going to be to talk about speciation and macroevolution. Speciation is the formation of new species, right? The development of new species. Now, let's digress a little bit. We say that in a population, individuals are genetically diverse, right? Even though they belong to the same species, they are diverse. And in that diversity, some changes can happen in the population so that there could be a shift in the population in terms of the type of observable features we are going to see, the quantifiable features we are going to see. Now, these changes in population can be so drastic over a long period of time that organisms that at one time recognize each other as belonging together may recognize each other as not belonging together anymore, to the point that they are not going to be able to interbreed, leave behind offspring that actually can be fertile and reproduce. Remember the concept of fitness, right? So that change in the population over a long period of time that produce organisms that at some point are not going to actually recognize each other as belonging together is called macroevolution. So we are going to dive into macroevolution today. So now, microevolution, the teeny tiny changes that happen at the genetic level in the DNA, right? One nucleotide being replaced by another nucleotide. Well, over a long period of time, this microevolution can lead to macroevolution. Because over time, you're going to have an accumulation of changes. These accumulations of changes can produce drastically different organisms over time. So, microevolutionary changes in the gene pool is going to cause an accumulation of changes, and that accumulation of changes is going to lead to genetic divergence. That genetic divergence is going to cause organisms that used to recognize together, that used to recognize each other as belonging together, to the point that they are not recognizing anymore each other as belonging together, right? So, in a schematic way of presentation, microevolution leads to macroevolution, and macroevolution leads to the development of new species or speciation. All right? I want you to remember that. Now, do we have any proof of this? Now, here we are showing a record of some fossils that were trapped in sedimentary rocks. But beyond this fossil that were trapped in sedimentary rocks that can be associated to today living organisms, I want to show you here in a modern way of showing the relationship between organisms, the comparison in DNA. So today, it is possible to actually read the genome of this butterfly here, this organism, the genome of this bird of prey, and this other bird of prey. Now, obviously, these two birds are very closely related. Now, you won't see much here, right? Because, you know, this sequence that you see here is very complex. But what I'm trying to show here is that these organisms, we can compare their DNA, see at which point they are closely related or not. We are going to check out the differences and the similarities. These differences and similarities are going to allow us to draw a classification of organisms and to determine if these organisms belong together or not. But very importantly, we can tell that these organisms come from a same common ancestor by comparing their genetic information, DNA. Now, we can ask the following question. What is a species? Now, in a biological level, what we consider a species, it's organisms that are able to interbreed, produce offspring, which means that they are actually sharing gene pool. Now, that's not all. This offspring, they have to be able to interbreed and produce themselves offspring that are fertile so that the gene pool can be transmitted from one generation, can be passed down rather, can be passed down from generation to generation to generation. Now, here is a very interesting thing. So we have here 3 species of flycatchers. Okay, this species of flycatchers, unless you are a specialist of birds, you would say that these organisms are the exact same species. But believe it or not, when you look at this organism, how similar they are, not just in terms of size, but everything about them physically allow you to come to the conclusion that these organisms belong to the same species. But in fact, if you bring them together, this organism will not be able to interbreed. The Acadian flycatcher cannot interbreed with the willow flycatcher. Likewise, the Acadian flycatcher cannot interbreed with the list flycatcher, and vice versa, right? They only reproduce among the very specific species. They are as different, right? In spite of the fact that they look very much the same to the layperson like myself, right? If I was to see those birds, I would think, oh, it's the same kind. But while they are not the same kind. All right. Now, in the concept of biological species definition, well, when you consider, for instance, humans, whether you come from Kenya, or you come from Asia or India, right? These organisms are able to reproduce and leave behind offspring that are themselves going to be fertile and produce new organisms. So when we look at humans, the concept of race in terms of biology doesn't mean anything, right? It doesn't mean anything because there is no such thing as race in the humankind. But let me close that parenthesis. You understand the concept of what a species is. Now, what causes organisms that look so much alike, like these 3 flycatchers I showed you earlier, to not be able to reproduce together so that they are different species? Well, there are some barriers that exist. These barriers are multiple kind. I'm going to dive into these different barriers. The first barrier I'm going to address is the reproductive barriers. These reproductive barriers include what we call isolation mechanisms. These isolation mechanisms are going to prevent organisms to successfully reproduce together and produce offspring that themselves are going to be fertile. There is a barrier at that level, right? Now, we are going to have pre-zygotic barriers. These pre-zygotic barriers are barriers that prevent even the sperm and the egg to meet at the first place, right? These mechanisms that prevent fertilization are going to be, for instance, habitat. If 2 organisms may then look alike, don't live in the same environment, don't share the same habitat, there is no way they're going to come together and reproduce, right? If one lives in Ohio, the other one lives in Pennsylvania, okay, or Connecticut, well, in as much as they are all staying in their space, they will never come together and mate and reproduce offspring, right? That's a barrier. That is a prezygotic barrier. The second barrier is the temporal isolation. The temporal isolation, it's basically that one species is prone to reproduce in the fall, for instance, while the other one is prone to reproduce in spring. So when they come together in the same geographical area, they find each other at a time when they are never matching in when they are ready to reproduce, right? So again, one is going to be ready for copulation in the fall. The other one is going to be ready for copulation in the spring. These are 2 different seasons in the year, right? Which means that physiologically, they are not at the same stage. Therefore, even though they were to copulate, they will never produce a zygote, okay? Because the sperm has to be there at the same time the egg is there. If the sperm is there when the egg is never there, if the egg is there when the sperm is never there, then there will never be reproduction. That's the temporal isolation. Then we have the behavioral isolation. In the behavioral isolation, the male and female have to seduce each other, right? But if one is not able to seduce the other one, because he's not simply exhibiting the behavior that is going to seduce the male or the female, then there will never be sexual intercourse, right? That's what we call behavioral isolation. Then we have the mechanical isolation. In the mechanical isolation, the two organisms are able to come together. Nevertheless, the sexes do not match. In other words, the male and the female can try to have a sexual intercourse, but the structure of the male organs and the structure of the female organs are not just complementary. And because they are not complementary, well, guess what? Copulation cannot be successful. Therefore, no chance of producing an egg, to produce a zygote and to produce an embryo. That is not going to happen. Finally, but not least, you have gamete isolation. In gamete isolation, you have the intercourse that is able to take place. You have the sperm that is going to be able to in the gamete isolation, there is sexual relationship. However, the sperm cell is never able to fertilize an egg, and an egg cannot be fertilized by a sperm cell. All right, so you have a copulation, but there is no fertilization of the egg by the sperm. That's the gamete isolation. Then we have the post-zygotic isolation. In the post-zygotic isolation, you have the formation of a zygote. However, that formation of a zygote is not going to go to full term. In other words, the zygote is going to systematically die. That's one level of barrier. The other level of barrier is that, well, the zygote is going to grow, develop into an embryo. From the embryo, you have a fetus, and from the fetus, you have a newborn. However, that newborn is going to be a hybrid that is sterile. Okay? And because a hybrid is sterile, well, there is no passing down of the genes. Sometimes, though, the hybrid can reproduce, so in the F2, however, that F2 cannot leave behind offspring, so there is no fitness. Right? So these are the different levels of barriers that exist in terms of reproduction between organisms that belong to different species. So again, to kind of repeat myself here, you have the habitat isolation, okay? The pre-zygotic isolation mechanisms. You have the habitat isolation. So species at location occupy different habitats, right? Then we have the temporal isolation. Please review that, okay? They reproduce at different seasons, right? The behavioral isolation, right? They are not able to seduce each other because just one is not exhibiting the proper behavior, okay? And then you have the mechanical isolation. In the mechanical isolation, you have the genitalia between the two species that do not match, okay? So that there cannot be intercourse. And finally, you have the gamete isolation, which is that the sperm cannot reach and fertilize the egg, okay? So that's the pre-zygotic isolation mechanism, okay? Now, let's dive into the post-zygotic isolation mechanisms. The post-zygotic isolation mechanisms, you have that fertilization occurs, but the zygote does not survive, right? That's zygote mortality. Then we have the hybrid. The hybrid survives, but the hybrid is sterile. Or the hybrid is fertile, but the F2 hybrid has reduced fitness, meaning inability to pass down genes to offspring. So here we have a prezygotic isolation that shows here the blue-footed bobbies that actually are found in the island of Galapagos. Now, these two birds that you see here, they actually are exhibiting a behavior that they are trying to seduce each other by actually showing off of the nice blue feet, right? If the female is seduced by the male and vice versa, then they are going to be able to have intercourse and produce offspring. Now here we have a horse and a donkey. The mating between a horse and a donkey is going to produce a mule, okay? And a mule is known to not be able to reproduce. It's infertile. All right, now the speciation can occur because of geographic isolation. That geographic isolation is called allopatric speciation. So here we have species of salamanders that are found in California. In specific, they occur in specific areas, and very importantly, there is a valley. Actually, there is a valley in this area that separates the organism in the west coast of California from the east coast of California. So these organisms that got isolated because of the valley now never got the chance to meet each other again. So that over time, they end up growing features that at the end of the day, they were not able to reproduce anymore, right? However, if by some good chance they meet each other, right? Rarely they can actually copulate and produce offspring. But it's not common that this is going to happen, okay? So these organisms have evolved different ways because of geographical isolation. So initially, they were the same species, but eventually over time, they became isolated. Now, allo means different. Patric or patria means homeland. So this organism and this organism right here, they are isolated in the space, right? All right. So here we are showing the same thing, right? So the same organism, the same type of organisms along the Central Valley of California. They have evolved in different species because of allopatric speciation. Then we have the case of sympatric speciation. In the case of sympatric speciation, sympatric means the same, right? Sympatric, the same environment, the same geographical area. So here we have the example of some wheats. So the wild wheat has 2 N chromosome equal 28, while another type of wild wheat actually has 2 N chromosome, which is 14. Interestingly, these two different species of wheat were able to form a hybrid. And that hybrid contained 21 chromosomes. That hybrid actually was not able to leave behind offspring. However, what was seen is that this hybrid that was sterile, if there is a duplication of the genetic information in this hybrid, it's going to give a new type of plant that actually can reproduce. Okay? That new type of wheat, it's actually the bread wheat that we use today to produce the flour that we use for bread production. Okay? St. Patrick's speciation is not very common. It's not very common. Nevertheless, it happens, and particularly in plants. It doesn't happen typically in animals, but we do observe that in plants. So here we have one population. That one population developed into two or more reproductively isolated groups, right? Now, again, St. Patrick means the same geographical area, so no geographic isolation in the St. Patrick speciation as opposition to allopatric speciation. All right, now we saw the instance of polyploidy right here, and polyploidy, it's just that you have the genetic information that is present more than twice. Okay, so that genetic information is doubled, right? In a case, for instance, of a human, if we were polyploid, we would be, for instance, instead of having 46 chromosomes, we can have 46 chromosomes plus 21, plus 23, I'm sorry, plus 23, okay? Or 46 chromosomes plus 46 chromosomes, okay? Now, you can see here, it's 21 plus 21, that's 42 chromosomes. That's completely double, right? The amount of chromosome in one single individual. Now, polyploidy is not very common in animals. However, there are some rare instances, like the case of the salamander, right? That actually has is polyploid, but it's not very common in animals. Now let's address adaptive radiation. Now, when we go back to the story of Darwin, observing different finches, right? The different finches Darwin observed were actually traced back to a common ancestor. And from that common ancestor, many different type of finches developed. Some finches that were feeding on hard seeds, some finches that were feeding on flowers, some finches that were feeding on insects, on different sources of food. Based on that, they evolve a different way. Now, let's take a look at these finches right here. So we're going to split them into two groups. One group is the tree finches, and the other group is the ground finches. The ground finches are the ground-dwelling finches. Now, in the tree finches, we see that there are many variants of the tree finches. We're going to have some of them that are going to be vegetarian finches. Okay, notice their beaks. Then we have the large insectivorous tree finches. Then we have the small insectivorous tree finches. They are not obviously the same. Obviously, the large insectivorous and the small insectivorous, they are both insectivorous. Nevertheless, they don't eat the same size of insects, right? This is going to be because, well, they're going to isolate from each other by the type of diet they're going to have so that they don't have to compete with each other, right? Then we have the woodpecker features, we have the warbler features, right? Now, going in the ground features. In the ground features, we are going to have the large ground finches with a large beak. We have the medium ground finches with a medium size and a medium sized beak. The small ground finches with a small body, right? And the sharp beaked finches. And again, these beaks are different based on what they eat, right? And then we're going to have the cactus ground finches. Okay, so adaptive radiation is basically that variety of different organisms coming from the same origin, but that specialized based on the pressure from the environment, right? And that pressure for the environment, and also, I have to say, inter-specific relationship, right? Competition, right? Is going to force them to specialize for a matter of, what do we call it? Resource partitioning. There we go. Now, the fossil records are going to show that while you have evolution that happens over time, we can tell that organisms that live today in the modern time have relatives in the old times where we don't see these organisms anymore. Paleontology, it's a discipline that allows us to actually go after the fossils and try to tell the story of life. So here we have some fern leaves. Well, one fern leaf. That one fern leaf was on Earth about 245 millions of years ago. And the giant ferns that existed at some point got destroyed. And these giant ferns end up forming the charcoal we are extracting today, the oil that we are extracting today, right? We have the midge, which is some kind of insect, right? That existed about 40 millions of years ago. And you have this insectivore mammal that existed about 47 millions of years ago as a proof that, right, life existed way before this modern time.